subtle infiltration and parasitic attachment, because the way the worst comes in, once she comes in, she kind of latches on and creates like a bond. And I say this because the worst usually finds you in situations where you feel like you're down to your last. You have either a choice between just enough to keep going and not really do anything, but just have a couple of band aid amenities, or just sitting with nothing and not able to make a real investment. And you might experience this in times when, like, let's say, you're just short on your rent, and you have another bill to pay, and you're essentially kind of falling behind, and you're at that tipping point. You've experienced those points where you're at that tipping point where you have a choice to make, where you're at a crossroads where you feel like you don't have quite enough resources, money, or energy, whatever it is, to fully do what it is that you want to do to get out of the cycle. But you do have enough money that if you aren't choosing to be responsible, to put it towards bullshit amenities and vices and gamble it and dunk it off, or escorts, or just put it towards food, or just anything that's unhealthy for you. And when you're faced with those kinds of choices, that's when the worst comes in, because that's dealing with that kind of energy where it's like, okay, that moment when you're even considering going back to something that you either liberated yourself from, or that you know deep down is not the best for you, but you're in a space where it now looks appealing. That's where the alteration comes in, because the only reason that said thing that you know is not appealing is looking appealing is because you are faced with an escapism, which escapism resides within the sacral chakra. That's where those unresolved and repressed traumas come in. That's where the worst comes in, because the worst always makes you feel like, when you come back to her, or the thing that ends up meeting those vessels requirements to manifest that portal for you, that's where the worst comes in and robs you. And every time the worst comes in, remember that anytime you were facing that direction, you were always better off before you ever even started to face that energy or that direction. You could have did a lot more before then. So when we're dealing with a subtle infiltration, this is more like an indemnity. An indemnity works best when you think that you have a friend, and you think that you have someone that you can trust, and then they steal when you're sleeping. That's how this energy works. Whereas Asmodeus may be more of a physical energy, more aggressive. It may manifest as more aggressive outwardly, and a robbing of an external energy. The worst, or entities like succubi, these energies are generally going to be a lot more in the sacral chakra. So this also means that you may get more of a, how do I want to put it? Illusions and imagination, dream state rituals, vivid dream states, lucid dream states within reality, and desires that either become so vivid that you feel like you have to enact them out. Usually you run into people energetically that will essentially not have a head metaphysically, because they're representing the lack of loyalty and simply coming to drain an energy. The worst is very interesting because, again, with this subtle energy, when you're receiving the thing that you want, it's very hard to pick up on something that's slipping in through a crack. So, Worm operates by exploiting cracks in the auric field caused by trauma and unresolved guilt. She intertwines herself into the root and sacral chakras, creating dependency. And I think that dependency is really important to note, because that's where it becomes even harder to break away. Because also she likes to lock you in with guilt and shame and dependency, especially for like people who have, because it deals with traumas, a lot of times sexual trauma or hypersexuality or a lack of sexual identity, being DL, a lack of being able to properly identify your sexuality, heart chakra traumas that also trickle from unresolved energy in the sacral chakra, also manifest as unhealthy expressions of love in the heart chakra. So this, for example, like with people who may be DL, who have difficulty expressing their exact love interest may use relationships and connections as friendships, quote unquote, to actually connect or express their feelings and their romances in a way that is not actually seen on the surface. And this is another area where, when we talk about infiltration or dark places, a lot of times being on the fence about your sexuality and what you're authentically interested in creates dependencies, and it also creates cycles. And when we talk about dark places, the dark crevices and where worm resides, instead of like necessarily like openly facing certain challenges and things, or being honest about what it is that you want to express and connect with, the worst plays on certain connections and may make you lie about the nature of the connections, the friendships, justify secret connections with trans people in the community, things of that nature, and then act as if and treat hetero women on the masculine surface a different way. And then you may wonder why, women are receiving like certain residual diseases, because the residual is coming from the masking and having to have somebody else take the forefront of the situation, when behind the scenes in these dark areas, there's these waters that haven't been diluted. Remember, I said this psyche water is the equivalent of still water, and if you know anything about still water, that water is very dangerous and has a lot of contaminants and pollutants. This water hasn't been moved, so we have entities that are operating in this space, moving this quality of psyche water around. And when that psyche water is very contaminating, very cross-contaminating, and when shared, because this isn't out on the surface, and sun is one of the main things that purifies, this amplifies those toxic traits and shares that energy with the rest of the vessel, as well as all the exchanges energetically and physically that are exchanged between that person. So the worm gets nasty because the worm allows you to believe that what you're doing doesn't really harm anybody because you're doing it in the shadows. But in reality, a lot of that energy is brought to the light in other ways. And it really does a lot of detriment for the person in the long run, because this attachment is almost like an intercoiling. And the more you go back to worm or the words, the more you become interlocked, to the point that you sometimes create a karmic cycle between here and what I refer to as the eighth chakra, which deals a lot with karmic cycles, but that's for another time. But essentially, this area gets amplified and karmic cycles get amplified. So, yeah, very, very nasty succubi, very, very nasty lustful energy. And I think that it's very important that, as not just men, but just as a human collective, that we know the entities and we know the energies that can be associated or that can be created from a lack of intent or just loose intent. And sometimes when people are harboring or carrying very dark, unresolved traumatic energies, you share in that energy with them when you create a connection with them. So it's really important to be mindful of who and what you're connecting with, and how to understand how to align and release and purge these types of energies, purge these type of qualities, purge these types of frequencies and lifestyles out of your auric field and out of your physical body.